On a frozen December morning in 1866, 81 U.S. soldiers rode out from Fort Phil Kearny, and vanished into the snow. Within 40 minutes, not a single man was left alive. What happened beyond Lodge Trail Ridge? Was it overconfidence, a fatal miscalculation, or the flawless execution of one of the most cunning battlefield traps in frontier history? This is the untold story of the day 2,000 warriors rewrote the balance of power on the northern plains, and left a mystery that still echoes in the wind. In the iron-gray dawn of December 21, 1866, Fort Phil Kearny stood like a solitary outpost clinging to survival in the frozen heart of the Wyoming wilderness. Its rough-hewn walls, built from fresh pine logs, groaned under the weight of snowdrifts that climbed nearly halfway to the ramparts. The wind, a constant and merciless predator, hunted through the gaps in the stockade, slipping its icy claws into every corner of the dimly lit barracks. Inside, soldiers lay huddled beneath threadbare wool blankets, their breath clouding the air with fleeting plumes that glowed faintly in the lantern light. The smell of damp wood, unwashed bodies, and cold metal seemed to seep into the walls themselves, a smell that carried with it the isolation of a place far beyond the reach of comfort or safety. This fort, one of 3 lonely outposts along the Bozeman Trail, was more than a military post. It was a fragile lifeline for the gold-hungry prospectors pushing toward the Montana gold fields, a thin thread of protection for those determined to cross a land that had its own guardians. The Powder River Basin, which the trail carved through like a scar, was no empty wilderness. For the Lakota Sioux, the Northern Cheyenne, and the Arapaho, it was sacred ground, hunting grounds passed through generations, and they would defend it with the ferocity of wolves protecting their den. Among their leaders, one name was spoken with a mixture of fear and respect, Red Cloud, the Oglala Lakota chief whose gaze burned with an unyielding vow. "No white man will cross this land without paying a price," he was known to have said, his voice measured, his tone carrying the weight of a promise. From the snow-draped hills beyond the fort, warriors watched silently, their presence never in sight but always felt. It was a constant, gnawing tension that settled over the outpost like an unbroken storm cloud. Colonel Henry B. Carrington, the fort's commander, bore that tension with the stoic awareness of a man who understood the arithmetic of survival in hostile country. Educated at Yale as an engineer, Carrington thought in lines, measurements, and calculated risks. Every patrol, every work detail, every load of timber hauled back to the fort was weighed against the dangers that prowled just beyond the range of sight. He had poured months of effort into fortifying the post, supervising the building of the walls, drilling the garrison, and ensuring that the daily wood trains returned with enough fuel to hold back the winter. Firewood was life out here. Without it, cold could kill faster than any bullet. But not all of Carrington's officers shared his caution. Captain William J. Fetterman, at 32, carried himself with the restless energy of a man who believed the war had yet to offer him the victory he deserved. A veteran of the Civil War, his lean frame and sharp features seemed carved from the same hard lines as his convictions. He spoke of the Lakota with open contempt, dismissing them as little more than an obstacle to be cleared. One cold night, gathered around the flames with fellow officers, Fetterman had declared with absolute confidence, "With 80 men, I could ride through the whole Sioux nation." The words hung in the air, part boast, part challenge, and more than a few men feared they might one day be tested. On the morning of December 21, the wood train left the fort at first light, the mules' breath steaming in the frigid air as they dragged the wagons toward the forested ridges. The civilian teamsters hunched in their coats, cursing the cold, axes bouncing against their shoulders. They knew the risk. Every trip into those hills was a gamble, a roll of the dice against the watchful eyes that might be waiting. Before long, a scout came pounding back through the gates, his horse lathered, his face tight with urgency. "The wood train's under attack." The alarm snapped through the fort like a shot. Carrington reacted quickly, sending Lieutenant Grummond with 50 men to protect the wagons. It was a measured decision, enough force to make a difference but not so much as to weaken the fort. Yet minutes later, more messengers returned, their voices sharp with urgency, their words carrying the edge of escalating danger. The colonel weighed the options and made the call to send a larger relief force. 80 men, under Fetterman's command. But before the captain left, Carrington's voice cut through the winter air with the clarity of steel on stone: "Do not pursue beyond Lodge Trail Ridge, under any circumstances." Fetterman gave a curt nod, but inside, the order settled on him like a weight he intended to shed. The monotony of fort life, endless guard shifts, chopping timber, repairing walls, had ground against his pride. He did not see this as a rescue mission. In his mind, this was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment to prove himself against the warriors who had haunted the fort from the shadows. The detachment formed in the yard, the men stamping their boots, tightening scarf and glove against the cold. Most carried muzzle-loading Springfield rifles, their long barrels frosted with breath and snow. A few had Spencer repeaters, faster to fire but rare in number. 2 civilian frontiersmen, James Wheatley and Isaac Fisher, stood apart with Henry repeating rifles, weapons capable of unleashing a stream of bullets far quicker than anything in standard army issue. Their presence was a silent reminder that in the wilderness, sometimes skill and the right weapon mattered more than rank. The gates creaked open and the column stepped out into the white glare of midday, the snow crunching under boots and hooves. In the distance, the horizon was a blur of shifting white and shadow. It was there they first saw them, a small group of riders, dark shapes against the pale light, moving slowly, almost lazily, as if unconcerned. One of them was Crazy Horse, young but already marked as a warrior of cunning. His task was to draw the soldiers forward, away from the fort, away from safety. The riders called out in Lakota, their words rolling across the frozen air in tones that carried both challenge and laughter. They drifted just close enough to tempt a shot, then wheeled away before any bullet could reach them. One stopped to adjust a saddle cinch, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Another spurred his pony into what looked like a panicked retreat. It was a performance, every detail crafted to stir the hunter's instinct. And it worked. The column crested Lodge Trail Ridge, and the fort disappeared from view. Before them lay a valley shrouded in silence, the snow smoothing its curves, muting its distances. Beneath that silence, hidden in gullies and timbered folds, nearly 2,000 Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho waited. Painted for war, wrapped in snow-flecked blankets, they gripped their weapons and watched. Some held bows, others lances, and many clutched repeating rifles, their barrels dark against the white. The air between predator and prey was razor-thin, and only one side knew which was which. And still, Fetterman pressed forward. Snow whispered underfoot as the soldiers descended from Lodge Trail Ridge into the valley, their formation stretched thin, cavalry ahead, infantry struggling behind. The air was so cold it felt like glass in the lungs, every breath burning. Somewhere in that pale haze, Crazy Horse's riders appeared again, flickering in and out of sight between the folds of land. They laughed, called out, then turned their ponies in sudden flight, hooves throwing up plumes of snow. To the untrained eye, it looked like panic. To the seasoned hunter, it was the movement of bait in a trap. But the question remains, in that moment, did anyone in Fetterman's column sense what lay ahead, or was the hunger for battle too strong to hear the warning? The cavalry surged forward, spurred on by the thrill of the chase, while the infantry, burdened by coats heavy with frost, fell behind. The distance between the two grew with every stride, and the shape of the valley began to close around them. Fetterman's jaw was set, his eyes fixed on the retreating figures ahead. He had been told not to cross this ridge, but the horizon beckoned him like a challenge whispered in his ear. Somewhere behind him, the fort was already too far to see, and the ridge they had crossed might as well have been a door locking shut. Then the landscape changed. The decoys disappeared behind a low rise, the sound of their ponies fading. A silence fell, not the stillness of safety, but the breathless pause before the strike. In that heartbeat, the hills erupted. From gullies, from thickets, from behind every fold of snow-covered earth, warriors surged forward as if the ground itself had come alive. The valley rang with the shattering chorus of war cries, high and sharp, echoing from the slopes, rolling toward the soldiers like a wave that could not be outrun. Nearly 2,000 Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho poured into the open, their bodies flashing with painted symbols, their weapons raised. Arrows hissed through the air in dark arcs, finding gaps in coats and flesh. Bullets cracked from repeating rifles, faster and closer than the soldiers could answer. Horses reared in panic, their eyes rolling white, some throwing their riders, others crashing into the snow with the weight of wounds they would not rise from. The cavalry wheeled to face the attack, but the enemy was everywhere. Every movement met a counter, every gap was closed before it could be exploited. The infantry struggled forward to join them, but the ground between them was a killing field. Fetterman's men, caught in the middle, could see the circle tightening, warriors moving with deliberate speed, each step closing the space, each shot or arrow chipping away at their dwindling strength. They fell back toward a low rise scattered with scrub pine and jagged rock. Here, in what would later be called Massacre Hill, the soldiers tried to make their stand. Rifles barked, the smoke curling in the icy wind, but the cold was a cruel ally to their enemies. Muzzle-loading rifles fouled quickly, powder turned sluggish in the damp air, and many weapons failed to fire at all. In contrast, the Henry and Spencer repeaters carried by some warriors could send round after round without pause. The frontiersman James Wheatley, with his Henry rifle, became a lone anchor in the storm, holding his ground as spent brass piled at his feet. It is said that when his body was found, he lay in a ring of empty cartridges, each one a moment bought for the men around him. But courage could not change the mathematics of the field. There were too many enemies, too few soldiers, and nowhere left to retreat. The circle closed, and the sound of the fight became a maelstrom, the deep thud of bodies hitting the snow, the clash of rifle butts used as clubs when ammunition was gone, the guttural shouts of warriors driving the attack forward. For nearly 40 minutes, the fight raged in chaos. The soldiers fought with a desperation stripped of all formality, no longer a military unit but a group of men clinging to the space around them. Some broke and ran, hoping to cut through the lines, but the warriors closed like water, the escape routes vanishing almost as soon as they were imagined. Every path led back into the storm. From a distant vantage, Red Cloud watched, his expression unreadable, his mind focused on the precision of what was unfolding. The plan had been simple in its elegance and devastating in its result: lure them in, separate them from their support, strike with overwhelming force. In the end, it was not numbers alone that decided the day but the willingness to wait for the perfect moment. The question history still asks is this: was Fetterman blind to the trap, or did he see it and believe, even then, that he could break it? Snow began to fall harder, swirling into the smoke and the shouts. The white world closed in, muffling the edges of sound until the battle seemed to exist in its own pocket of time. Then, as quickly as it had erupted, it was over. The last shots faded into silence, broken only by the low moan of the wind. Massacre Hill lay still. The blue coats of the fallen were stark against the snow, the positions of their bodies telling the story of a fight that had no surrender. The warriors moved among the dead, taking weapons, ammunition, and supplies. For them, the removal of these items was not simply victory, it was survival. In the cold that gripped the Powder River country, every rifle, every cartridge, every scrap of cloth could be the difference between life and death. Some acts on the field were more personal, bound in the customs of war that carried meaning beyond the understanding of their opponents. Each had its place in the tapestry of defiance woven that day. Beyond the ridge, the fort waited in uneasy silence. Carrington stood on the wall, telescope in hand, searching for any sign of his men. All he saw was the distant trace of smoke curling into the gray sky. All he heard was the wind. Somewhere beyond sight, the worst defeat yet suffered on the northern plains had already been sealed. By the next day, when the relief party finally reached the site, the scene was one of frozen devastation. 81 soldiers and civilians lay where they had fallen, their faces preserved by the cold and expressions of defiance, fear, or grim resolve. Wheatley's body was found exactly as the legend claimed, his Henry rifle beside him, empty. Fetterman lay among his men, the boast that had followed him now buried with him in the snow. The weight of the loss was staggering. It was not just the number of dead, it was the speed, the precision, the utter completeness of the defeat. In less than an hour, an entire command had been erased. And yet, for those who had planned it, the battle was not merely a victory. It was a statement, carved into the frozen ground and carried on the wind. The Bozeman Trail would not be taken without resistance, and those who underestimated its defenders would pay dearly. The question that still lingers in history is whether the events of that day were inevitable. Could Carrington's orders have been obeyed? Could the trap have been avoided? Or was this clash, in that place, at that time, already written, the result of two worlds moving toward each other with no space left to turn aside? Dawn on the second day brought no comfort to Fort Phil Kearny. The wind still scoured the hills, carrying with it a silence that felt heavier than the snow. The relief party that rode out into the gray morning moved with grim purpose, their horses' breath steaming in the cold air, the only sound in a world muted by frost. As they crested Lodge Trail Ridge, the valley below spread out before them, and they saw what Carrington had feared but not dared to voice. 81 bodies lay scattered across the slope, the scene frozen in place as though the battle had only just ended. Some men had fallen in groups, backs to the same rock or tree, their positions telling the story of desperate last stands. Others lay alone, half buried by drifting snow. James Wheatley's Henry rifle was there, surrounded by an empty brass ring, the steel of the barrel rimed with frost. Fetterman's body was found near Lieutenant Grumman's, both lying close enough to suggest they had made their final stand together. No one was spared. The soldiers who had come to recover them worked in silence. There was no sound fit for that place, no words to balance the weight of what had happened. They gathered their comrades, wrapped them against the cold, and bore them back over the ridge to the fort. Behind them, the wind rose, erasing the prints of their boots as though the land itself wished to seal the memory away. News traveled quickly. By the time word reached Washington, the shock was immediate and profound. Newspapers seized on the story, their headlines screaming of the Plains' worst defeat. In city streets far from the Powder River country, the names Fetterman and Massacre Hill were spoken with a mix of awe and disbelief. How could so many have fallen so quickly? What had gone so wrong? In the halls of Congress, questions turned into accusations. Some demanded to know why Carrington had not led the rescue himself, why his orders had been disobeyed, and whether the army had underestimated its opponents. But out on the northern plains, the reality was simpler, and more dangerous. Red Cloud had struck a blow that reverberated across the Bozeman Trail. The forts along that path were now isolated islands in a sea of hostility. Every road, every water source, every stand of timber could become a trap. For those who traveled between them, every horizon carried the threat of ambush. The winter closed in with iron force. Snowdrifts piled against the stockade walls, the supply trains struggled to reach the forts, and hunger became a more immediate enemy than the warriors in the hills. Yet the war parties did not rest. They cut lines of communication, intercepted messengers, and struck at any who ventured beyond the gates. It was a war of attrition, and the defenders of the Bozeman Trail could feel the slow tightening of the noose. The question historians still ask is whether Red Cloud intended the Fetterman fight as a turning point from the start, a blow so complete it would break the will of the army to hold the trail. What is certain is that, for a time, it worked. By the spring of 1868, after nearly 2 years of relentless conflict, the United States agreed to terms that would have seemed impossible just months before. In the Treaty of Fort Laramie, the Army promised to abandon Fort Phil Kearny, Fort Reno, and Fort C.F. Smith, leaving the Powder River country to those who had fought for it. It was a rare moment in the history of the West, a negotiated peace on the terms of the Plains tribes. Red Cloud's War was the only one in which the United States conceded to withdraw entirely from contested territory. When the soldiers left Fort Phil Kearny, the stockade stood silent, its timbers weathered by snow and wind. The land around it was unchanged, the hills and valleys lying in the same patient silence they had before the first post hole was dug. But for those who had fought there, the ground was marked forever. The trail that had promised gold and opportunity now bore the weight of memory, the ruts softening under years of wind and rain, the echoes of hoofbeats and gunfire fading into the whisper of the pines. And yet, as history has shown, even the strongest victories can be fleeting. In the years that followed, the flood of settlers returned, not along the Bozeman Trail, but along new routes, on iron rails that cut through the plains like seams in a map. The buffalo herds that had once stretched to the horizon dwindled to shadows of their former numbers. The balance of power shifted again, slowly but steadily, as the forces of the United States returned in greater strength. Still, the memory of that day in December endured. The Fetterman fight became a story told in both camps, in the lodges of the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho as a reminder of what unity and patience could achieve, in the barracks of soldiers as a warning of what could happen when caution was cast aside. The field itself lay quiet, the snow covering the scars of rifle pits and boot prints, the wind carrying only the faintest echoes of a time when the valley rang with war cries. Standing there today, it is hard to reconcile the stillness with the violence that once consumed it. The sagebrush stirs in the wind, the ridges roll gently toward the horizon, and the air smells of pine and cold earth. But those who know the story say that if you stand on Lodge Trail Ridge in the hush of winter, you can almost hear it, the distant thunder of hooves, the sharp crack of rifles, and the final, breathless moments of a fight that was over almost before it began. The lesson of that day remains. The land remembers. And for those who walked away from it, or never left it, the question will always linger, was it a battle lost to overconfidence, or a fate sealed long before the first shot was fired?